A spring flood swells a narrow creek through Indian Territory, turning cottonwood roots into claws. A broken wagon pins itself against a fallen trunk. A buzzard hangs motionless on the wind. In the shallows, a woman's dress streams like river grass as the current drags her toward a snag of barbed wire left by a rancher's fence washed downstream. Eliza Harrow, a widowed settler of 23, has been bound and thrown into the water by men who want her late husband's claim and the infant she carries. Abandoned by her escort, hunted by a corrupt sheriff who calls it an accident, she has one breath left and a prayer that someone will see her hand before the river swallows it. But the rider who appeared at dusk was no savior. Before we begin, look closely at the undertaker's ledger from Fort Smith. One erased name and a water-wrinkled page prove someone should have died that night, and someone paid to pretend she did. The sky still held a thin ribbon of light when the flood reached its meanest voice. The banks crumbled in slow bites. Roots showed their pale undersides. Mud hissed against stone. Eliza's fingers, blue-white, clawed at the slick bark of the trunk that trapped the wagon. Her wrists were cinched with wire, the points already buried under skin. She tasted iron and silt. Her chest burned for air. A lantern bobbed once on the far bank, and then went black. Hooves thudded away on soaked ground. She heard a man laugh as if the flood itself were his hired hand. She put her face to the current to keep from swallowing it, counted to 3 the way she had taught frightened mothers to breathe, and let herself sink enough to slide under a loop of broken harness. The wire held. Her hair fanned like weed. She kicked once. The snagged barbed wire loomed ahead, like a crown of thorns sunk into the stream bed. She saw her own dress sweep toward it, and knew the creek would pin her there like cloth on a nail. A pony splashed into the channel. The rider came downstream instead of fighting the current. He angled his body, and the pony's ribs like water knew his hips. He said nothing at first. The creek said plenty. Each step of the pony shoved a wave that slapped Eliza across the face. She coughed and lost the thin store of air she had guarded. Hands, warm and sure, slid along her forearms and found the wire. A bone-handled knife flashed once in gray light. The wire parted with a dull sound. The pony's chest hit the barbed crown. The rider's leg took the scrape that would have been her ribs. He lifted her by the armpits and leaned back, so the current pushed them together toward the shallowest curl. She felt his breath against her temple and smelled smoke and wet leather and a faint, clean scent like cedar. "Hold to the mane," he said, plain and low. "Keep your head left." She did as told. He drew her into a slow half-circle, so the flooding creek itself carried her to shore. Her knees met gravel. She crawled up onto the bank and turned to her side to spit the river out. He cut the last of the wire from her wrists. The cuts welled dark. He pressed a palm to the meat of her thumb and kept the blood held in. He did it the way a man does something he has done before and wishes he had done earlier. "Name?" he said. "Eliza," she said, mouth full of grit. "Harrow." "Salu," he said. "Fox on water. Breathe." He looked at the water where the barbed wire still hissed in the current. He looked at the place the lantern had gone dark. "Those men come back. They will come quiet." Eliza pushed up on her elbows. Her belly was a hard moon under her wet dress. The child kicked once, urgent, like a fist against a door. She put a hand to her side and whispered, "I'm here." The creek slid on, as if it had done nothing wrong at all. Beyond the cottonwoods, a wide sky settled into night. Salu pulled a wool blanket from behind his saddle and wrapped her. He bound her wrists with soft cloth to keep them from splitting further. He moved as if time were a ladder, with rungs he would not miss. "Sheriff will call this accidental," Eliza said, voice thin. "He said my wagon slipped. He said the ford is tricky in spring. He said I should sign over the claim for safety and spare the county trouble." She turned her head and looked at the broken wagon pinned to the trunk. "He will stand at the church rail and pray about it." Salu looked at the mark the wire had left. "Sheriff wears a star," he said. "Star does not make a man true." He whistled once, a sound like a creek bird, and the pony came up the bank and stood with water dripping from its knees. He did not use more words than he needed. He watched the bend, where the current ran brown and fast, and fixed the scene in his mind, like a map he could carry in his head. He had watched a river take a brother once. He would not let water do a sheriff's work, if he could help it. A bullbat dipped low against the last of the light. Somewhere a cow lowed at a fence line broken by flood. The buzzard above leaned a notch and settled again. The land had the long, tired look places get after bad weather. Tsalu slung Eliza up behind the saddle and put her hands around his waist. He did not ask if she could ride. He rode for the timber on the far slope, where cedars made a dry-smelling dark. He kept to the edges. He cut sign with his eyes and made no sign with his hands. When he reached the shadow under the fattest cedar, he half whistled and half clicked, and a woman answered from inside the dark, with a short hum, like a mother calling a baby to her breast. Della Wolf came out of the cedar lodge with a cup already in her hand. She did not startle at the sight of a half-drowned settler. She had seen long years and hard springs. She wore her hair braided to keep the wet from it, and a deer-hide dress with a patch on one shoulder where a coal had burned through last winter. She said nothing until Tsalu set Eliza down on a roll of blankets by the doorway. Then her hands went to work. She stripped the wet cloth and wrapped Eliza in dry. She pressed nettle tea into her. She laid a palm on the belly and watched Eliza's face for the wince that would mean true labor had come. She nodded once, satisfied, and set a pot closer to coals. "You will live," Della said. "Child will wait a while, but you will feel the river in your bones for a day." She turned to Tsalu. "Who set the wire?" "Rooker cattle use that run," he said. "Wire breaks from his fence all the time, but this was tied at both ends to hold fast." He set the cut length on the dirt. The barbs were as sharp as bee stings. "A man who knows banks did this." Della's eyes tightened. "Then men will come to look for what the river did not finish." She looked at Eliza and saw the white line around her mouth that meant the woman held a story in that mouth, like a blade held in a boot. "You sleep first," she said to Eliza. "Talk when your tongue is not mud." Eliza tried to close her eyes. The lids trembled. The creek's tug still worked itself in the muscles of her arms and legs. Each time she started to drift, the sound of water rose in her ears and pulled her back. She watched the lodge's smoke shape itself against the cedar ribs and smooth out into a thin column, lost in the dark. She thought of a ledger in town, with the neat numbers of the dead and the way Asa Pike licked the tip of his pencil before he wrote. She thought of Reverend Mott's careful, tidy hand and his wide cuffs, and the way he said mercy, like he meant money. She saw Sheriff Voss's grin, cut thin and long, as if someone had drawn it there with a blade, and he had never quite healed. She saw Caleb Rooker's hat settled low, and she heard his promise at the ford, low and soft and crooked. "I'll ride ahead for help," he had said. "You keep the wagon moving." Then the sudden rush of men, and the slap of a palm over her mouth, and the burn of wire. Night settled all the way. The creek went to its deeper note. A fox barked once down near the flats. Della worked in the quiet. She crushed willow bark and wrapped Eliza's wrists. She hummed a tune that did not ask for words. Tsalu sat just outside and scraped mud from his boot heel with the back of his knife and kept his face toward the sound the river made when it found a new line through downed limbs. He did not sleep. He held the night like a man holds a fence, leaning his weight against it to keep cattle from pushing through. In town, under an oil lamp, Asa Pike ran a thumb along the edge of a ledger page that should have lain flat. It would not. The paper had a swell to it, a ripple, as if it had learned river and would not forget. He lifted the ledger close and caught the faint smell of wet. The sheriff had come an hour earlier, boots clean, hat dry, and said in his thick voice that the river had taken another. "Write the name," the sheriff had said, casual, as if names grew from his pockets. "Then strike it if we find we were wrong." Asa had stared at him. "Can I see the body?" he had asked, as he was required. "River takes faces first," Voss said. "No need for grief." He had smiled with his mouth and not his eyes, and placed a coin on the desk. "Right now, we have a county to keep steady." The coin lay in Asa's palm, like a hot thing. He had set it down and opened the ledger. He had dipped his pen. He had written the date and the weather and the place of taking. He had made space for the name and could not start the letter. The page had wrinkled in the middle like a brow frowning. He heard thunder, even though the storm had moved off. He heard the creak in his head, with a hum, like a church note held too long. Reverend Silas Mott sat at his table, with his cuffs rolled back to keep them from the ink. He did not like the way his stomach turned when he thought of the creek. He told himself some things require a soft hand. Mercy, he said to the empty room, to the cross on the wall, to the wife who had gone cold 3 winters ago. Mercy is a kind of truth. He opened the parish register and slid a scrap of paper under the page he meant to mark to prevent bleed. He wrote a hymn number first, the one for "The River Shall Not Have You," and he told himself that would make it right. Then he drew Eliza Harrow's name in his careful hand, and a small note in the margin, in case the sheriff needed to show anyone the church stood with him. He blew on the ink. He looked at the name while it was still wet. He drew the knife he used to cut the church bread and scraped at the letters until they blurred. He told himself it was better not to have the name at all, if there was a chance of mistake. The sound the blade made on the paper was small and ugly. He laid the knife down and closed the book and put his head in his hands and listened to the clock. The sheriff walked the empty street and touched each door with his knuckles, as if counting his own teeth. He owned nothing but the fear he could make in other people, and the place his boots took up on polished boards. The flood gave him a story. He would keep it. He would not let a settler woman or a Cherokee scout change his story. He put his hand on the shoulder of the boy, who sat outside the saloon with a broom across his knees. "River took a fool wagon," he said. "Tell anyone asks." The boy nodded. The sheriff looked down at the sweep of the broom through spilled sawdust and saw the letters it made by accident. He ground the heel of his boot over them and moved on. At the Cedar Lodge, Eliza woke with a start. The air felt thin. For a moment she thought she was still in the water. Then she smelled cedar and meat broth and felt the steady heat of coals. Della was there. "Drink," Della said. "You shiver from inside. Drink makes heat." Eliza drank and felt her jaw ache. The baby turned slow as a fish under her hand. She shut her eyes and saw the ford again. She saw Caleb's hat tilt when he lied. She thought of his father's face, big and red and thick with liquor. She thought of the fence wire along the creek, months of men cutting across deer trails without care. She felt the cut on her wrist throb. She set the cup down and touched the bone-handled knife where Della had left it point down in the dirt near the door. There was a pattern worn into the grip from decades of fingers. The knife was old and meant. It did not pretend to be more than it was. Salu spoke from outside without turning his head. "When I was a boy, our river took my brother," he said. "I was strong enough to pull him if I had stepped in a step sooner. I did not. I think on that time every time I smell flood. It keeps me from sleeping when rain starts." He half laughed without joy. "Tonight I will sleep after the day after next." He rose and ducked in. He looked at Eliza and then at Della. "I will go see where boot tracks end." Eliza touched the blanket tighter to her and looked at him. "He promised to ride for help," she said. Caleb Rooker said it like a man says he will fetch water. He let his horse's breath touch my cheek when he leaned near. Then he went, and the others came. Her voice went flat on the last word. "They tied my hands with the fence we both cursed last winter," she said. "They called the river justice. They said a widow should not hold land alone. They said a child slows a county." Della's face did not change, but something old and sharp looked from behind her eyes. "River keeps better justice than men," she said. "But men make more noise about it." She rose and put her hand on Eliza's shoulder and squeezed once. "We keep you quiet until the noise breaks itself," she said. "Then we show paper to men who can read, and chains to men who like to wear them. Then we pick our place by the creek where we can see the water coming." Salu moved like rain through cedar shadow. He found the place where the lantern had gone out. The ground held a confusion of prints. One set showed a toe turned out, where an old injury had never healed. He knew that walk. He had seen Caleb Rooker ride crooked and step careful when his feet hit the ground. He found the place the wire had been tied to a root and then to a stone wedged in mud. He shook his head once. Sharp. This was not flood work. This was a man's knot. He cut the end of the wire clean and wrapped it around a stick to keep it from cutting him. He tucked the stick into his belt and went back the way he had come, stepping in his own steps to leave less talk for someone else to read. Morning came pale and raw. The flood had lost some of its anger, but kept its weight. Eliza could hear the creak from the lodge like a long breath. Della put a clean dress on her, one of her own, with a strip of beadwork at the throat that had lost a bead and held the gap like a tooth missing. Eliza ran a hand over the short stitches of the mend and felt the plain care of them. She tried to stand, and the lodge shifted under her a little. Della guided her back. Not far yet, Della said. Your blood still thinks it is water. In town, Asa turned the page in the ledger and pressed the wrinkled spot as if a book could be calmed by a thumb. He wrote the weather again. He wrote the note about river accident. He left the name line open and told himself he would fill it once he saw a face. He had always seen faces. He did not like the way the sheriff had said no. He took a sheet of scrap and copied the lines he had written, slow, to fix them in his head. He folded the copy and slid it under the blotter. He told himself he was not brave. He told himself he was careful, and careful men live longer. He looked at the coin the sheriff had left and covered it with the folded paper. Reverend Mott opened the register again to see if the scrape showed through. It did. The paper looked thin. Where he had lifted the ink, he put his thumb on the place and felt the give. He closed the book and put it under the Bible for weight. He told himself he would visit the Rooker place to pray. He told himself he would ask the sheriff to show him the bank where the wagon had broken so he could preach about the dangers of spring floods. He did not like that he planned his sermon around a lie. He had not liked lies since he was 10, and his father had lied about drink, and the bottle had found him dead by the smokehouse. He said the word mercy again, too soft to hear. Sheriff Voss lit a cigar with a splinter and looked out his window at the street. He liked the way the morning made everyone's voice small. He liked being the first large sound. He blew smoke and watched it settle under the door. He tapped ash into his hat and did not care. He could always buy a new hat. He could not always buy new fear. He thought of the woman in the creek and the way barbed wire held things. He thought of the Rooker boy and his quick mouth and slow courage. He would need to put a stronger hand on that boy. He set the cigar down and buckled his belt one notch tighter, as if that made a man. By afternoon, Eliza could sit without seeing the room swim. The baby settled under her ribs and slept. Della made a paste for the wire cuts and told her they would scar in a neat line, like a small snake under the skin. You will always know which way is up when you look at it, Della said. You can point to the water with the same arm that remembers it. There was no pity in her voice. There was something better. It was a kind of standing. Salu came in and set the stick wrapped with wire on the floor. He looked at Della. Knots, he said. A man takes time. The river does not tie bowlines. Eliza stared at the stick. The wire glinted like a small animal, ready to strike. She reached to touch it and did not. She felt heat in her chest that had nothing to do with fever. It was anger. It ran clear. It made her vision sharpen, like dry air after rain. Caleb, she said. He spoke soft. He turned his horse away from the ford like he had heard a whistle only he could hear. Then the others came. One called me claim wife. One called the baby a burden. They talked like men who had been given permission to stop being men. Della stirred the coals and looked at Salu. You will need more than our 2 hands, she said. If the sheriff made the preacher scrape a page, he will make the undertaker write a lie. Eliza needs rest, Salu said. But a lie grows legs while a woman sleeps. He straightened. I will see Asa Pike, he said. He counts the dead for pay. He is a man who hears his own counting in his dreams. He will not like the numbers wrong. He went by the back ways that ran between the tannery and the stable, where the ground kept good tracks for those who knew them. He watched for deputies who bragged loud when they rode and quiet when they walked. He stepped into Asa's place by the alley door. Asa looked up with his mouth already open to say he was closed, then saw who stood there and shut it. He had seen Salu bring in men the river had chewed and knew the difference between a man who broke the law and a man who held it tighter than the law did. Tell the truth, Salu said without preface. Did you write a name that you did not see this morning? Asa's eyes went to the ledger, even though he did not mean them to. Sheriff says I write what the county needs, he said. And what do you need? Salu asked. Asa looked down at his hands and saw ink where it should not be, and a small smear of dirt from the bank where he had walked to see for himself, and found nothing but water and the slime of flood and no body. I need to live long enough to go blind in this chair, he said. But I have a brother in the ground who would spit at me if I let a woman's name get drowned on paper after the river failed at it. He pulled the ledger toward him and opened to the page. The wrinkle showed. The blank line for name shone, white as a bone. He took a scrap and copied the date and the words river accident and folded it tight and slid it toward Salu with a palm that shook. I do not know if this helps, he said, but paper makes a map. Sheriff can burn a map. Maybe there are more maps. His voice went small at the end. There are, Salu said. Church keeps one. He nodded once. Thank you. He put the folded paper inside his shirt. He left the way he came and kept to shade. Eliza, left in the lodge with Della, listened to the creak and to her own breath. She wanted sleep, but could not. Her mind made lists as if a wagon inventory lay open in her lap. She counted things lost and found. 1. A wool blanket heavier than it looked. 2. A loaf of bread in cloth that had floated free and gone to mud. 3. A small tin of carbolic she had saved for birthing fever, gone now to the creek's mouth. 4. A small book of prayers with the edges bent from years, her mother's hand in the front, now likely lodged under a root where fish would nose it. 5. The bone button from her collar, broken by a hand that thought it had the right. 6. The claim paper tied with twine that she had sewn into the lining of her skirt on the morning she left, still there, soaked but safe. She put her fingers on the hidden seam and felt the paper under cloth, and almost laughed, because the absurdity of paper surviving more than flesh is one of the cruel jokes the world likes. Della saw the small lift of her mouth and nodded without asking. By late day, the flood had dropped a hand's width. Gravel bars showed their backs. The buzzard left. The creek kept moving like a tired horse that still had a town to reach by nightfall. Salu came back with the copy of Asa's ledger lines and a set to his jaw that meant his anger had found a place to sit. He showed Della the lines. He showed Eliza the place where the name was blank. Blank is a kind of confession, he said. Men who write with sure hands do not leave white if they mean truth. Eliza laid a finger on the copy. The paper felt warm from his skin. The sheriff will fill that space, she said. He will put my name in it and call it mercy, to spare me a burial I did not ask for. She drew a breath that hurt. He will stand with the preacher, and they will use hymns to hide nails. Della put the kettle on. Then we choose where to stand when they sing, she said. We choose a place where water can hear us. She looked at Salu. And we choose what we will do when men bring fire. The light went gold and then went thin. Eliza slept sitting up and woke with her hand against the baby's foot where it pushed. She breathed, and the hurt in her ribs lessened. She listened, and the creek sounded less like a voice and more like a road. She wanted to be angry and stay angry, but anger is a thing that burns a woman up if she keeps it to herself and has nowhere to throw it. She looked at Dela, who had built a life out of small fires, and the patience to sit beside them. She looked at Salu, whose silence had more in it than most men's talk. She felt the shape of her choices like stones under a shallow current. She could run to the next county and let her name be written wrong. She could stay and be called a ghost until a man set her on a chair in a church and made her speak only when spoken to. Or she could walk the creek and read it and let it tell her where the lie would break. Night pressed in. The lodge breathed. Della sat with a bone needle and pulled thread through a tear in a child's moccasin an elder had left to be fixed. Eliza watched the quick in and out of the needle. She heard hoofbeats then, far and muffled and wrong for a single rider. Salu rose without sound. He moved to the door and looked out through the small slit between cedar slats. He smelled smoke that did not come from their fire. He tilted his head and counted breaths between hoofbeats. He looked at Della and said one word, "Brand." They felt the first lick of heat at the base of the door before they saw the flame. Della stood and took a damp hide from the wall and slapped it over the crack. Smoke wormed in anyway. A shadow moved outside close enough for Eliza to see the shape of a hat brim against firelight. A voice spoke. "House holds a ghost," it said. "Sheriff says we fetch her." Eliza's heart hit once hard, and then went thin and fast. Della's eyes went flat. Tsalu held up his hand for quiet. The voice outside laughed. Something seared against the cedar. The smell of scorched wood mixed with the sweet smell of cedar sap. Another voice, higher and jittery, said, "Make your mark." There was a hiss as hot iron met green wood. The brand burned a curl into the door, no bigger than a man's palm, but big enough to carry meaning. The mark was the same as the cattle mark on the Rooker herd. A rope dropped from the cottonwood limb out front and swung once, and then hung still. The men waited, sure of their fear's work. Eliza looked at the brand and did not think of running. She thought of the undertaker's ledger and the way the page moved when touched. She thought of the parish register and the scrape mark. She thought of the sheriff's cigar ash settling under a door like smoke that forgot it had fire. She pushed herself to her feet. Della put a hand to her chest without looking at her face, only feeling the thump of the heart under her palm. "Not yet," Della said. "Breath first, then step." Tsalu moved to the back flap and cut a slit just enough to pass through. "We go to the water," he said. "Fire is loud. Water is quieter and meaner." He held the flap and looked at Eliza. "Can you walk soft?" he asked. "I can walk," she said. Her voice did not shake. She took Della's knife and tucked it into the fold at her hip. She felt the old handle warm against her skin. She took one long breath and made her legs listen. The baby turned once as if to say it paid attention too. They slipped into the trees. The men outside the front laughed and talked about ghosts and rewards, and how rope looks against a good sky. Della went second, and her steps were lighter than smoke. Tsalu led, and the creek's breath pulled them toward it. The moon traded itself between cloud and branch. The brand on the door glowed, and then dimmed, and then glowed again. The rope swung once more. They reached the bank and slid down the cut where deer went for water. Tsalu put a hand out and stopped them with a touch before their boots hit the last ledge. He listened. He heard another sound under the sound of fire and men. It was the slow, heavy knock of hooves through shallow current. Sheriff Voss had not come, but someone else had. A horse stepped out of the willow shadow, where a private path met the water, and stopped with its knees in the flood. The rider sat tall and held his hat brim low. Caleb Rooker looked out over the creek to where the lodge's firelight made the cedars dance. He did not see them under the bank. He lifted his arm and signaled to the men at the front with a lazy twist of the wrist that made Tsalu want to cut it off at the elbow. "If she slips to the water, take her," Caleb said. "If she burns, we say the creek pulls flames into itself." He grinned like a boy who had stolen a pie and believed no one would notice the gap. Eliza stared at him and saw not just the man, but the boy he had been, spoiled and quick to take and quick to run. She felt no love left from the old days when his laughter had been warm, from the few church dinners where a joke had made her smile, before she learned his jokes always ended in someone else's pain. "You will write my name wrong," she whispered, not like a wish, but like a statement of what crimes he could manage. Della's hand tightened on her wrist. Tsalu's hand went to the rope he had hung earlier, across the narrow part of the creek, to catch brush and fish. He could pull it now, and flood the bank lower down, and make a curtain of mud and water between them and the men. He could make chaos. He could get them out. He could also drown a man by accident. He measured his breath and his choices. The men at the front grew tired of waiting. One of them called out, "Ghost, you got 1 minute." He laughed at his own wit. The laugh sounded hungry. The brand on the door steamed, where Della's damp hide hissed against it. The rope threw a shadow like a slender neck over the clearing. Caleb shifted in the saddle, and the horse stamped and tossed its head, catching scent of them for a moment, and then losing it to smoke. Salu met Eliza's eyes in the dark and nodded once. He would cut the line if he had to. He would pull the water through these men and make the creek do work again, but this time for their side. On the far edge of town, a guard at the fort gate scratched his name into a plank with a nail and thought about his supper. He did not know a folded copy of a ledger line lay in a scout's shirt headed his way, nor that a sealed hospital file on his lieutenant's desk had more in it than it seemed. He spat and drew his initial again. In the parsonage, Reverend Mott watched a moth batter itself against the glass of his lamp and thought of wings and fire and how both are stubborn. In the undertaker's shed, Asa lifted a canvas sheet because the sheriff had finally brought him a body to point at. He expected river work. He braced for it. He saw the dress first. Eliza's dress, torn at the hem where a wheel had bitten it. He lifted farther and looked at the face. It was not Eliza's. It was a girl from the edge of the Rooker place who had not been seen since last planting season. Asa let the sheet fall and felt a small sound leave his throat. He looked at the sheriff's coin under the scrap on his desk, and a hot shame ran through him and made his hands shake. He reached for the ledger and felt the pages wave again. He was done with waves. Back at the creek, the men at the front moved toward the door with torches high. The rope at the cottonwood swayed. Caleb leaned forward, eager to see the fire catch and make quick work of it. He did not get what he wanted. Salu yanked the hidden line. The small dam he had built from brush and stones at the narrow flume gave way. Water surged with a wet sigh that sounded almost like relief. It hit the men's boots and put out the first two torches. One man cursed and grabbed for balance and pulled another down with him. Fire hissed on the ground like snakes. Smoke blew sideways into men's faces. Della squeezed Eliza's hand and pulled her along the cut, where the water's new edge gave them a curtain. Caleb's horse danced and backed, vexed by the sudden change. Caleb pulled the reins and swore, and did not see the shadow that moved behind his right stirrup. Salu slid by him so close he could have cut the leather and sent him down. He did not yet. He had other things to pull first. Eliza, Della, and the truth. They slipped into the black seam between cedar and creek and went downstream with the water for a dozen paces before climbing the bank at a place where roots made steps, and the flood had not yet chewed them away. Eliza's breath met her throat like a fist, and then softened. The baby stayed quiet, as if it understood that stillness is a kind of voice. Behind them the men shouted, and went this way and that. Caleb tried to sound like command, and mostly sounded like a boy lost in a storm. The brand on the door hissed and went dark. The rope hung empty. The creek carried the fire water away in streaks that caught the moon and then broke apart and went dull. They ran low to the ground until the lodge lights were a smear through trees. Then they walked because running leaves a story the ground can read. Salu set his feet in places he had set them 100 times. Eliza set hers in his and felt like she was learning a new language. Della kept pace at her shoulder, neither ahead nor behind. They did not speak until they reached a stand of young cottonwoods where the bark was white and the ground held less mud. Salu stopped and listened again. He heard no pursuit close. He heard only the cut water makes when it finds a new bed. He let out a breath he had held too long. "We cannot stay here long," Della said. "Men follow fire with more fire, and then drink, and then bravado. We will not stay," Salu said. "We will move where paper waits." He touched the folded copy of Asa's ledger lines in his shirt. "Fort keeps a file of a woman pulled from water with no name," he said. "We give that file a mouth and a face. We make two papers speak to each other. Then men who like to pretend will have to choose between what they say and what they can read." Eliza looked back through the trees to where a thin smoke line still rose, slow and ashamed. "I will not be the county's ghost," she said. "If they like that kind of story, they can tell it without me." She stood straighter. Pain ran along her wrists in a neat line. She did not mind it. It kept her awake. They made a small camp by a fallen log, where grass had already started to grow over the dirt heave. Della set a kettle, but kept the flame low and hooded. Salu ate without tasting, and watched the dark. Eliza lay on her side, and the baby nudged once, twice, and then settled. The night let go of its tightness by inches. Owls worked their slow loops. The creek did not sleep, because water does not. Eliza knew sleep would be a stranger to her for a time. She watched a beetle walk across the back of her hand, and thought of how small lives continue, no matter what big men think they have done. In town, Asa saddled his old gray and tied the ledger under his coat. He took the copied page and tucked it into his hatband, where a passing deputy would not think to look. He felt like a boy leaving home to fish, and feared like a man going to war. He turned the horse's head to the road to the fort, and thought of the first dead he had washed after his father took the job. The boy's hair smelled like berry soap and river both. He pressed his heels, and the gray stepped into the night with a steady willingness that made Asa feel better than he had felt all day. Reverend Mott stood by his open window and let the night air cool the sweat on his neck. He thought of the woman whose name he had scraped and of the hymn number he had written. He sang the first line under his breath. He did not like how his voice shook. He took the register down, opened to the page, and traced the scrape with his fingertip. He saw, as if for the first time, how ugly a scraped letter looks, where a letter should be. He closed the book and looked up and said a small, not very confident prayer, that the truth would find him before the sheriff did. He blew out the lamp and sat in the dark to listen to his own cowardice. It had a specific sound. Near midnight, the men from the Rooker place cooled and grumbled. The sheriff rode in at last, hat tilted, mouth long. He looked at the dark lodge and the wet ground. He smelled the water that had put out the fire. He swore once under his breath and did not raise his voice. He did not like not being the first sound. He told the men to go home in a tone that said their mothers had called. He turned his horse and rode to town, hands quiet on reins, mind making new knots. He hoped the river could not cut. The next morning looked clean and innocent as young linen. It lied. The creek had carried away most of the marks of the night. It left enough. A burned patch under the brand's place, a scuff where a rope had rubbed bark, a set of tracks by the water where a pony had stood with careful knees. Caleb found those and spat in them like a child. He walked the bank and found the place where water had surged and shook his head at a thing he did not understand and blamed it on witchwork, because blaming is easier than learning. He rode back to the ranch and told his father he was handling it. His father laughed and coughed and poured another drink and told him to make sure the preacher said the right words on Sunday. Caleb said he would. His hand shook when he lifted his glass. He put it down and told himself he would tie better knots next time. Eliza and Salu and Della reached the old trace by noon, a two-rut road that led to the fort. They kept to the trees. They passed a place where a wagon had broken and a wheel had been set against a stump to be mended and then forgotten. Eliza touched the rim as they went by, like a woman touches a grave she will not linger at, so as not to call attention. A fox crossed ahead of them and looked back with the cool gaze of a creature that has learned men's noises and found them unremarkable. At a bend in the trace, they saw a boy fishing with a stick and a string. He looked up and opened his mouth to call, and then shut it when he saw Della's look. He tilted his head, and then, for no reason other than he felt it in his bones, pointed toward a path that led around a marsh where the road ran wet. They took it. They passed his mother's wash hung between two trees and did not touch it. The woman looked at them and did not look at them. She had a way of widening her eyes so the world slid off without sticking. By late day, the fort's roofs showed through the trees, low and neat, as if men could draw straight lines against the sky and make the sky obey. Salu slowed them. He had no love for posts where papers made decisions before men did. He had seen enough of those to know a page can save a life or turn it to ash. He took the ledger copy from his shirt and smoothed it once. Eliza touched the place where the name line lay blank and felt another heat in her chest. This one, like hope that has not yet chosen what shape to take. Della put her hand on Eliza's back and kept it there for a breath. The baby moved under Eliza's hand and pushed against her palm and then settled again as if the child knew the sound of walls ahead and did not dislike it yet. Inside the fort, Lieutenant Henry Black read the sealed hospital file again, because the ink at the bottom, with the small note in a script he did not recognize, had troubled him all afternoon. He called over Private Mason, a man who had a Cherokee wife and could make sense of marks the lieutenant could not. Mason bent and looked and said, "That word says water pulled, and that word says a name that means fox." Black sat back and tapped the folder against his knee. Sheriff Voss had sworn no rescue had been made, but here was a note that said otherwise, with a hand that did not lie to itself. Black had wanted a quiet posting. He had wanted to count crates and write reports and show his mother someday a clean pair of hands. A small wrinkle appeared between his eyebrows that would not leave for 2 years. He set the file down and stood and looked out toward the trees beyond the walls, as if he could see a woman and a scout and a healer coming along the edge of light. They came. Asa Pike's gray stood at the gate with dust in its coat and patience in its bones. Asa looked smaller on the horse than he had when he started, like a man who had given some of his height away to the road. He lifted a hand with a copy of the ledger line, like it weighed more than a book. The guard made a half joke, and then saw Asa's face, and did not finish it. He took Asa to the lieutenant, because that is how stories sometimes go right by accident. Blake looked at the copy, and at Asa's hands, and at the ribbon of mud dried under Asa's nails. "You have something to say?" he asked. "I have something I can write," Asa said, "and I can point you at men who can speak it, if your ears are good." His mouth tried to smile and failed. "I write the dead," he said. "Yesterday, I nearly wrote a lie." He looked past Black, as if he could see the creek from inside the fort, and his eyes watered in a way that did not have to do with grief, and did not have to do with smoke. "I will not do that again," he said, simple as bread. Black nodded once, slow, like a man taking a weight he had not planned for, and finding it not as heavy as he feared, but heavy enough. He lifted his eyes and saw over Asa's shoulder 3 figures in the tree line, who stood like they held each other up with their shared shadow. He felt his mouth go dry. He felt the weight of the star he did not wear, and the papers he did sign. He raised a hand to call the guard to bring them in, and then put it down, because some people come better when not called like dogs. Before the sun could slide all the way behind the roofline of the fort, before the lieutenant could say the easy words that would make hard things harder, before Asa could sit and let his breath settle, before Della could count the elders in her head she would need to convince later, a horseman punched out of the brush near the cedar lodge they had left and galloped into town with a brand still smoking on a board tied to his saddle. He dragged a rope from the cottonwood as if to show it had work left in it. He made noise like victory. Sheriff Voss stepped into the street to meet him. The man held up the brand like a banner. "We marked the witch house," he said. "She'll show herself if she wants it back." Voss took the brand and weighed it like it was a scepter, and then smiled in a way that made the boy with the broom put his head down. At the edge of the fort clearing, Eliza stopped. She felt something in the air that told her she stood between 2 kinds of law. One would try to fold her into it, neat, as long as she did not wrinkle. The other had no fold at all, and would blow away if she did not hold it with both hands. She looked at Salu, and at Della, and then at the walls. Salu nodded once. Della's mouth pressed into a thin line, and then eased. Eliza stepped forward, and the child kicked, as if approving of the road. They had not gone 4 strides, when a bird call cut the air from behind them, wrong for the hour. Salu turned his head the slightest amount. He knew that call. It meant men coming on foot, hungry and quiet. He put his hand out in front of Eliza, the way a man stops a horse from stepping into a hole. He looked toward the trees they had just left and saw, low and mean, the shine of a rifle barrel where no shine should be. He did the math in his head between the fort gate and the trees, and the rolls of men who think paper can be shot down. He moved to put his body where bodies should go, when bullets mean to write the story. A sound like a hot knife pressed to green wood came from behind them in the trees, by the lodge they had fled. The smell of scorched cedar drifted up the trace again, faint but clear. Della's eyes went to the wind. She did not change her face. She took Eliza's hand and squeezed hard enough to hurt. Eliza did not pull away. She faced the fort and then the trees, and then the fort again, and lifted her chin. "We go where the records are," she said. "We make them speak while we still breathe." She took another step. Back by the lodge, men finished what the first had started. A new brand mark flamed up bright and then went dark as they pressed the iron too long, and the heat died. A rope swayed. Someone had whittled a new notch in the cottonwood, as if carving into a living thing made a man big. The creek, patient as a judge growing old, kept moving every branch and splinter and ash that fell to it toward the ford, like it meant to lay the pieces there at someone's feet and wait to see who picked them up. Night would come before the papers spoke to each other. Men would move in the dark with torches and with appetites and with lies to feed. The undertaker's gray would stand while Asa went in to show his copied lines. The lieutenant would square his shoulders until they looked like they belonged to him. The preacher would lie awake and feel the scrape under his finger, like a tooth that will not let a tongue alone. The sheriff would polish his star with a corner of a handkerchief and see his thin grin in it, like a crack in glass. At the cedar lodge, the brand smoked once, and then stopped. On the cottonwood limb, the rope stilled. The mark on the door, raw and ugly, gleamed in moonlight like a wound that would scab by morning and still be a wound. And from that door down to the creek, prints led in one direction only. They did not walk straight to the fort gate. They waited in the stand of young cottonwoods until the wind turned and carried camp smells from the walls. Coffee, bacon fat, horse, and with it the soft clank of chain against post that said men were at ease, not on alarm. Salu watched the tree line they had left, counted heartbeats between the wee, strange bird calls, and led Eliza and Della on a bend that put brush between them and the rifles he had seen. He moved with the patience of water finding the low places. When they came to a wash cut deep by spring storms, they slid down and crossed where the mud took their ankles and let them go. Eliza's breath showed in little white puffs, even with the day warming. The baby kicked once, as if to ask what this new smell of iron and tar meant. Eliza whispered that it meant walls and papers and men who liked both, and that she would make both serve instead of smother. At the gate, Asa Pike already stood with his hat in his hands and a look on his face like a man who has just realized a simple addition he has done for years has been wrong by one, and that one matters. Lieutenant Black took the ledger copy and placed it beside the sealed hospital file. He did it within sight of the guard and the clerk, so the act itself would have witnesses. He did not look at the sheriff's neat deposition yet. He let the two other papers lie together for a breath, as if they might talk. He glanced up and saw Salu in the trees with two women. He made a small motion with two fingers, not a summons, an acknowledgement. Salu waited for a wagon to rattle through the gate and then moved when its noise covered the sound of their steps. The guard pretended to adjust the strap on his rifle and did not notice anything else. Inside the yard, Eliza's wet hair clung to her neck and then lifted as a breeze managed to find it. Della's face set in the shape of a woman who would not be hurried. Salu handed Asa the stick wrapped with barbed wire. "We will need this," he said. Asa looked at it as if it were a snake killed the day after it bit, and did not thank him, because thanks would make it seem as if this were somehow a gift. Black touched the sealed file with one finger. He lifted the flap and read the line again. He pointed to the margin and said to Private Mason, "Tell me it again." Mason read the syllabary slow and careful. "It says water pulled, and it says Fox, sir." Black nodded. He met Eliza's eyes for the first time. She expected a young man to look away from a woman wet and dirty and heavy with child. He did not. He held her gaze the way a man holds a door for someone carrying a load. "Ma'am," he said, "we will hear you." Eliza's throat closed for a heartbeat. She swallowed and found her voice. "Sheriff will not," she said, "and he makes the preacher scrape a page to suit him. She put her hand flat on the sealed file. "This says I breathed," she said. "Keep it where a star cannot reach." Black nodded again. Asa shifted his weight. He cleared his throat. "Sheriff brought me a body," he said. "Dress like hers. Face not hers. I aimed to write a lie because he told me the county needed it." His voice dried up. He pushed the words through anyway. "I do not think the county needs it. I think the sheriff does." Black's jaw worked as if he were chewing a thought. He set the sealed file and the ledger copy together and laid his palm over both. He spoke to them as much as to the room. "These two agree," he said. "If a third paper lies, it will be alone." He lifted his hand and looked at Salu. "You will speak for yourself," he said. Salu nodded once. "I cut wire in a creek," he said. "I pulled a woman out. That is my whole story." He did not add how his brother had slipped under a river years ago while he watched. He did not need to. It lived in the set of his mouth. A clerk came forward with a quill that had a neat nib and the self-importance of a man who believes in straight lines. Black shook his head. "No fresh paper," he said. "We have enough ink on this, as it is." He looked at Eliza. "You are safe inside these walls for now," he said, measured. "But papers alone will not walk you to the preacher's house, or the undertaker's shop, or back to your own door. We will do what we can. I will send a note to the town, saying any alteration of the parish register will be seen as interference with an army inquiry." Mason blinked at that, surprised. Black did not blink. "If that tone feels heavy," Black said. "Good." Della tilted her head. "Paper frightens men who like to hold it," she said. "But men who like fire will still light it." Black did not bristle. He had an older sister who spoke like that when he was too sure of his tidy answers. "Ma'am," he said, "I can also put a soldier at the church door and another at the undertaker's. I cannot put a man in every cottonwood. You three know the timber. You decide where the creek will be useful." Asa set his hat back on his head and stood taller. "I will take my ledger out into the sun," he said. "Sheriff likes shadows. He can chase me there." Mason, who had seen how words become bullets in the wrong mouths, sucked his teeth and muttered, bold for a man with ink on his fingers. Asa heard and did not disagree. He gathered the copy, tucked it inside his shirt, and went for his gray. He would not hide in his own house while other people risked more. Eliza watched him go and felt a small stitch of respect. It eased something in her chest that had been pinched tight since dusk when the creek tried to take her. They did not linger at the fort. Salu disliked walls. Eliza disliked feeling watched. Della disliked coffee that smelled burned. Blackie gave them a canteen and a small roll of clean bandage and said, "I will send 2 men not clever enough to make trouble and not foolish enough to run. They will stand like posts and be useful that way." Eliza almost smiled. She did not quite. She said, "Keep the sealed file where the sheriff cannot reach." Black touched it. "Yes," he said, and meant it. They took the trace back toward town, not along the ruts, but parallel through trees, where dapple made their shapes. Uncertain, the sun had moved and threw new stripes through the leaves. The air had the sweet, sour smell of flood receding. Birds were busy. Squirrels scolded. A hawk cried. It was an ordinary afternoon pretending to be simple. Eliza's shoulders loosened and then tightened again when they reached the lane that led toward Della's cedar grove. Smoke no longer rose there. The brand would have cooled. The rope would hang quiet. Salu held up a hand and took the lead. He moved like shadow. He set his palm on the trunk and felt the heat still in the brand's char. He touched the rope with the back of his finger, and it swung once. He looked at the ground and read the story. 2 men had stood and argued. One had spat. One had paced. A third had wandered off to pee and left a different kind of mark that made Salu shake his head at how men think they leave no trail. Della would not let the brand be the last mark. She took a stone from the creek, flat and round, and rubbed it across the char until ash came up and the edges blurred. "No man's cattle mark will be the last picture on my door," she said. Eliza watched the ash fall like black snow. She thought of the parish book with a scraped name. She did not like the kinship between the 2 acts. Both were defacings, one in wood, one in paper. She told herself their answer would be to write, not scrape. They went to ground before dusk, on a hill above the mill bridge, where the creek narrowed, and men had built a crossing, with planks and hope. Eliza could see the town's few roofs from there. Smoke lifted like thoughts that had not yet chosen words. She saw the church's white paint scabbed where winter had pried and summer had shrunk. She saw the undertaker's low building crouch behind the livery. She saw a new fence line by the Rooker path, wire bright, ill-placed. She watched and counted. She kept her breath slow. She pressed her fingertips to the hidden seam inside her skirt, where the claim paper lay soft as flesh now from water. She would dry it later, and press it under weight, and make it ready to be read. For now it sat under the cloth like a warm secret. Night came with less rumor than the night before, but noise came anyway. Men do not like to be told they are wrong by weather. They argue louder on the second day. A deputy rode a loop through town and back, and the clank of his stirrup iron on the buckle put a taste in Eliza's mouth, like old pennies. A woman called a child in, and the child yelled back in that particular defiance that says everything is ordinary. The mill wheel creaked where driftwood had lodged against its cogs and dragged it one notch every few breaths. Water made a rough song as it dropped from the wheel. Salu could read mood from that sound. Tonight the wheel said not anger, not ease, but waiting. He left Eliza and Della under the cottonwoods and slid down into the seam along the bank where a man could listen to town without being seen. He crouched across from the sheriff's office where lamplight lay thin under the door and made gold lines on the dust. He listened. He heard paper slide. He heard a man curse when the pen blotched. He heard the word marriage and the word certificate and the word backdate. His jaw tensed. He scraped his thumb along the knife handle until a tiny sliver of old bone came loose and stuck under his nail. He let it sit there and sting. It kept him from walking through the door and cutting a sheriff across the mouth just for the sin of speaking. He moved on. He went to the parsonage window and listened there. Reverend Mott's steps made a nervous pattern on the floorboards. He could count the distance, the turn at the corner, the pause by the shelf where the register lay. He heard the sound of a page opened and the small wet sound of a man licking a fingertip to separate paper. He heard a breath drawn deep and held. He heard a knife drawn. He heard it put down. He heard the register close. He heard a man not sleeping when he lay down on a bed. He pushed himself back from the wall and left Mott to his own ghosts. When he returned to the cottonwoods, Della had a bundle open with small cakes, wrapped in corn leaves. She handed one to Eliza. "Eat," she said. "Your blood is a lazy mule until you feed it." Eliza ate, and the cake tasted of rivergrass flour and honey that had hidden in a stump all winter and survived. She swallowed and felt steadier. She looked at the creek. She thought of all the small lives in it, minnows and crawdads and everything that does not matter to men with stars. She felt a sympathy for things that keep moving, because if they stop, they die. Near midnight, a lantern bobbed along the far bank, slow and purposeless. It stopped near the bend beyond the mill, where baskets grew tangled in rootwork, and old stories tied to those roots said sometimes voices whispered. The lantern wavered, and then steadied. Salu watched with the kind of attention that reaches out like a hand and touches the thing watched. The figure holding the light wore a dress, Eliza's color, and tear. The head moved. Hair showed loose and dark. The light swung side to side like a woman would when she walked cautious along a slippery bar. Salu's eyes narrowed. He took in the way the feet placed, careful but heavy with a man's weight carried in a man's heel. He watched the face as the lantern lifted. He saw the jawline and the shadow of stubble above the lip, clumsy, burnt with soot. He knew a trick when he saw one. He did not smile. He felt a tight heat rise in his chest that had nothing to do with humor. The figure turned, so the lantern threw light on the water, and people at windows could see it if they looked. "Ghost," someone whispered near the mill. "She walks." The word moved as fast as a horse when the ground is hard. Windows lifted. A woman crossed herself. A man spat, and then made the sign he makes when he thinks nobody is looking. A child pointed and was pulled back from the sill. The lantern walker reached the end of the sandbar and disappeared into shadow, and then reappeared farther down, as if she had walked through water and not made a splash. She felt the insult of it like a hand on her shoulder from behind, without permission. Della's breath grew thin and sharp. "They would use our own dead to scare us," Della said, not to be answered, just to make the thing sit in the air where it belonged. Salu's hands relaxed. "Good," he said softly. "A lie this big rattles itself loose quicker. People will come to look close. Close is where tricks fail." Before dawn, gray, Eliza woke with a sick certainty that the sheriff would make his move at the hour when decent people like to think prayers had purchase, and weak people like to think no one watched. She told Salu she wanted to see Reverend Mott's register with her own eyes. He did not argue. He had already meant to go. He took them along the creek to the back of the parsonage, where the ground gave good cover. Della waited beside a lilac bush that had been tricked into early bloom by 2 warm days, and would be killed back by late frost 2 weeks hence. Memory would later keep the smell. Salu lifted the latch on the kitchen door with the blade tip and slid them into a room where a loaf under a cloth made a small hill. The house felt honest, even with a lie in it. Eliza went straight to the shelf where the register lay, because these books always live in the same places in every town. The way lamplight always falls the same on a Bible page. She slid the register free and opened to the place Reverend Mott had pressed under the big book. The scraped line showed like a scar. The hymn number, "Shall We Gather at the River," lay beside it, neat and careful. Eliza touched the scrape with the back of a fingernail. The paper felt thin. She read the faint lines of her own name beneath the abrasion, as if a ghost of ink had chosen to stay. She felt a fury so clean it did not choke her. "He put me in the ground with a song," she said. "Then he tried to pull me back, as if I were a fish he had thrown away by mistake." Salu tilted the book so lamplight from the window hit the page, and the surviving strokes became darker. He drew the little notebook from his pocket, and drew what he saw, not the letters, but the way the scrape had been made, with a blade edge at a slant. "He may tell truth if asked right," Salu said. "If not, the paper will tell enough." A floorboard creaked in the next room. Reverend Mott stood in the door with his hair not combed and his cuffs unrolled. He looked older than he had yesterday. He did not say a word. Eliza did not hide the book. She lifted it and showed it to him, as if a person shows a child the broken toy the child broke and then mislaid. "You did this," she said. "Why?" Mott's hand went to the doorframe as if to steady himself. "Sheriff said the county needed calm," he said. "He said a river accident comforts people because it makes a pattern we recognize. He said better a memorial hymn than a trial." He swallowed. He said he could not finish. He stared at the torn paper. "I am a weak man," he said, too quiet. "I called it mercy because I did not like the words that go with what it was." Eliza's fury had room now for pity's small seed. She did not water it yet. "You will read this out loud when the time comes," she said. "You will say what you did. You will say who asked." Mott nodded, one jerk like a man whose head has been yanked by a rope. "Yes," he said, "I will." He reached up and rubbed at the scrape with his thumb, as if he could smooth it. He could not. They left before the sheriff's deputy could turn the corner with his morning whistle and his news to sell for smiles. Della said nothing as they slid back along the creek. She had balanced the cost of mercy in her head and found it wanting 10 times over. When they reached the mill bridge at full day, all three slowed without planning. The creek had dropped another inch. The wheel caught and turned one full tooth for the first time since the flood began, and on that turning, a child on the near beam, hair stuck to her cheek, leaned out too far to watch the water carry off the sticks she threw. The old man at the mill shouted too late. The child's heel skidded on a wet plank. She pinwheeled. She slid. She went over with a cry that cut the morning like glass. Eliza moved before thought. The creek had taken her once, and she knew its tricks now. She bolted for the bank where the water snatched at the posts. Salu ran for the plank that jutted farthest, and leaped for the rope the miller kept tied on a peg. The child went under, up, under. Eliza hit the shallows, and felt the old pull tighten around her calves, like hands. She did not care. She threw herself forward, in the same line the child's body took, as the current pushed it toward a snag of roots that would catch hair and hold it. She caught a handful of dress and a handful of air that the creek would have taken, and hauled the little body against her, with a grunt that tore her throat. The child writhed and screamed water. Eliza wanted to stand, but the slick plant that felt like hair under her boot peeled, and she lost balance and went down to her chin. She held the child up with both arms and felt her own feet go loose. Behind her, Tsalu's rope hissed out and smacked the water otherwise. He planted himself, knees bent, and threw the loop. Eliza felt the child seize and cough and claw her. She tightened and spoke without language, just sound, a low hum, like Della's lullaby. The loop fell too wide. Tsalu pulled, gathered, and cast again, in one breath. The miller waded into his thighs, and then felt the old break in his leg tug, and could not. "Go farther," townsfolk shouted. 2 women ran with shawls. A man on the far bank crossed himself again without irony. The sheriff, 2 streets off, turned his head toward the noise, and felt that old small fear that comes when stories slip out of a man's hands. Eliza kicked and felt purchase, and shoved backward inch by inch, the child like a weight that wanted to float up, the creek like a hand pushing them both down. Tsalu's loop landed over her shoulder. She wedged her elbow through and heaved with her legs while the rope went tight and burned the skin along her arm. The child's head came clear. The child coughed out a plug of water, and air came in, and her scream exploded like a startled bird. Eliza laughed once, crazy, because a scream is a kind of life, too. She gained the last 2 steps by scraping her knees bloody on rocks she could not see. She stood, and the child hung from her, with arms like vines. People surged forward and then stopped because the look on Eliza's face told them not to touch what she carried yet. She moved to the grass and turned the child on her side and pounded her back twice, and more water came. The child's chest heaved and then settled into wet sobs. Eliza felt her own body start to shake. The baby under her ribs rolled and then lay quiet in the warm afterstorm like a fox in its den. The mill yard filled with the sounds that follow a fright. Too much talking, then sudden quiet, then laughter that is part shock and part joy. The old man at the wheel grabbed Eliza's arm and said, "Bless you," and meant it in no tidy way. 2 women dropped shawls around the child and rubbed her limbs hard to bring blood back to the surface. The child's mother ran in, hair loose, eyes wild, made a noise that did not belong to any language, and fell to her knees so fast she skinned them. She scooped her girl and kissed her hair, and then looked up at Eliza with a face that wrote gratitude in big letters. Eliza nodded once, afraid her own control would break if she tried to speak. Tsalu coiled the rope and handed it back to the miller, who took it like it was a holy thing. On the raised street above, Sheriff Voss stood with his hands on his hips and his mouth in that thin line. He watched the cheer move through the crowd like a wind and flatten his lie in the same motion. He did not show anger. He felt it like heartburn. He turned and walked away in that measured step that says a man's feet could count off distance to a gallows without needing eyes. Word ran ahead the way it does. By noon, people had started calling Eliza Ghost, in a new tone, the kind that makes a legend and forgets the woman. She saved a little one, someone told Reverend Mott, as he stood on his porch, staring at the river with his collar unbuttoned. He did not smile. He did not weep. He went inside and opened the register to the scraped line and put both hands on it, like a penitent on a rail. He whispered the hymn number and did not sing it. He closed his eyes and saw the woman's face. He heard her say, "You will read this out loud." He knew he would. He did not know if he would be alive after, but he did not weigh that too heavily. The scales in his head had other things on them now. Caleb Rooker heard too. He sat in his father's kitchen biting a hangnail and pretending to listen to talk about cattle and grass. He had not slept. Ghost stories had gotten into his head and rattled there, and he could not tell whether he feared the creek's work or the woman's persistence more. He imagined strangling both. He imagined riding after the sheriff and telling him to finish it, and then pictured himself tied to the same rope by men who did not like loose ends. He told himself he would go to the preacher and tie it up with paper. Instead, make the marriage, he said to himself. Put her name under yours. That will make her quiet. He said it out loud, finally, foolishly. His father laughed and coughed and spat into the fire and said, "Marry a ghost, boy. Your mother would rise up and box my ears from her grave for raising a fool." Caleb flushed and went red all the way up his neck. He stood and left so fast his chair fell. He did not pick it up. That afternoon the elders met in Della's yard, 3 men and 2 women who had lived long enough to see every trick water and white towns could play. They sat under a cottonwood, with a scar on its trunk, where lightning had struck 5 summers back, and the tree had decided to live anyway. Salu spoke first, short. "Wire in the creek," he said. "Sheriff's coin on a ledger. Preacher's scrape. A woman not dead saves a child." He held up the stick with wire and put it on the ground, where they could see the brand mark stamped into the twisted bit. Rooker's symbol. Della spoke next. Longer. She told them of Eliza's work with women on the trail, and that the child in her would come, honest, and soon. She told them of the brand burned on her door. She told them of water pulled through men to douse fire. One elder gray bear closed his eyes and nodded. "Water girl is pleased," he said, half jesting, half not. Another, little acorn, who did not like white papers, spat to the side and said, "Let soldiers fight soldiers. We have gardens." Della's eyes cut to him and held him. "Gardens burn when lies grow," she said. "You know this." He looked away and then back and grunted. "So," he said, "we shelter the woman and the man and the child, but we do not throw our bodies at a star to watch it shine brighter because we die." Della accepted this with a small tilt of her head. "We use the creek," she said. "Let it be the one to push." A young man ran up, out of breath, cheeks raw. "Men at the parsonage," he said to Salu. "Rooker boy with them. They carry a paper like a banner." Salu stood. Eliza, who had sat quiet through the council, as if not to tilt the balance with her wont, felt the old tremor start in her legs and then stop, because fear had a new shape now. It had edges she could grasp. She rose with Salu. Della put a hand on her arm. "You will not walk into a whip," she said. "We go to the side. We always go to the side." Eliza nodded. "To the side," she said, and meant not dodging, but flanking. At the parsonage, Caleb stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and his mouth wet. He had the look of a man who believes paper can bless what he cannot. Sheriff Voss leaned against the post, like a man leaning against his own lie. 2 deputies stood at angles, to make a wall with their bodies. Reverend Mott held the register in the crook of his arm and the breadth of his shame across his chest. He had not put his collar back on. He had not put on his righteous voice. Caleb thrust a folded certificate toward him. "Do it," he said. "Backdate it. We were promised. She promised. She said she would. She said—" He stopped chewing words and tried to look like a man. He failed. Voss said, "Make peace in your parish, Reverend." He smiled without humor. "Tie what's loose." Mott looked at the paper. He looked at the men. He looked at the book in his arms. He looked over their shoulders because that is what men do when they wish for help and do not want to name it. He saw 2 soldiers standing at the end of the walk, their faces blank in that military way that is either calm or indifference. He saw Lieutenant Black halfway down the street, holding a folder under his arm like a shield. He saw Asa Pike behind him, pale and shaking and trying not to. He saw, beyond them, under the cottonwoods by the creek, a flash of blue dress he recognized, and a man with hair pulled back, and a woman with iron in her mouth. He took one slow breath. He opened the register. He turned not to the back where he could tuck a marriage. Easy. He turned to the page with the scrape. He cleared his throat. "I have a line to read before I sign anything," he said, voice thin and pointed like a small knife. Voss's shoulders came up a shade. Caleb flushed again. "What does that have to do with—" he began. Mott raised a hand, small but steady. "I wrote a name here," he said, pointing to the faint strokes. "Then I scraped it when told Mercy demanded it. Mercy did not. Sheriff told me to. That is the truth." The deputy on the left shifted his weight. Voss did not move. It is a trick men learn. Stillness when truth lands can make the truth doubt itself. Mott did not let it. He looked at the soldiers. "I will read this in church on Sunday," he said, "and I will say who asked me to do it." The smaller deputy coughed and looked at the sheriff. Voss's mouth did not even twitch. "You will do what your soul tells you, Reverend," Voss said, tone mild enough to curdle milk. "And if your soul leads you to slander, we will see to the law." Eliza wanted to step onto the porch and say one true sentence that would wreck the whole scaffold. Della's hand on her arm tightened once. "To the side," she said again, soft. Salu nodded to Black. The lieutenant raised his folder 2 inches, a sign agreed on without being agreed on. He would move to arrest the sheriff if given the right lever. Asa licked dry lips and stepped forward, small, brave. "I have copy," he said, and held up the paper. Voss finally showed a line of teeth. "Undertaker," he said, almost kind, "you attend to your dead. The living is not your business." Asa's throat worked. He kept his hand up. Black took the paper, and the moment stopped, like a clock someone had put a finger on. Over at the mill bridge, unnoticed for a minute by men arranging their weapons and words, the wheel tightened and turned smooth for the first time in days. The child Eliza had saved, rash-cheeked and chastened, walked hand in hand with her mother across the far end and paused to drop a flower into the water. The flower spun and danced and went under the wheel and popped up on the other side and went along on its way, with the look of a small thing pleased with how the world liked to carry it. 2 boys stood on the rail, with one foot tucked behind the other, to show poor balance. Did not scare them. The miller, forgetting old brakes, ventured out a step too far to knock snagged limbs loose with a hooked pole. The log he jabbed at swung, rebounded, and hit the pole. The pole flew. The miller lurched. He grabbed for the rope. It slipped. He went over with his mouth open for a curse and got water instead. The shout ran down the street and twisted around the parsonage and tugged everyone. Caleb, hunger for spectacle stronger than discipline, turned his head. Voss turned his half, annoyed. Black looked straight, then sideways, then made the choice men make when 2 important things happen in one breath. He ran for the bridge. Asa, God bless him, ran too. Mott closed the register and held it to his chest, ironed by fear into a straight thing. Eliza had moved with the first cry, body knowing before mind. Salu moved with her. Della followed, knife under her shawl, eyes scanning for men who liked to strike from behind when a town's attention tilted forward. The miller hit the water and went heavy, like men do when they carry years in their joints. He bobbed once and came up with his hands out like a baby who wants to be lifted. The current tugged him toward the same root snag that had wanted the child. The 2 boys on the rail lost their bravado in the same second and shrieked. One threw his arms wide for balance, and the other grabbed his shirt, and both could have gone if the mother of the saved child had not screamed in a voice that put iron in their legs. Eliza reached the near pilings and ran down the slick bank to the notch where she had stood an hour ago. She did not think of the baby then, or rather, she thought of the baby in the way a woman thinks of her own bones, assumed and included. Salu leaped for the rope peg, and again, his first throw went wrong because the line snagged on the mill wheel tooth where a sliver of wood caught it, and a precious heartbeat went. He cursed once in Cherokee, soft and mean. He yanked, freed it, and looped again. Black hit the planks and did not pause for command. He grabbed the rope behind Salu and braced his boots against a beam because he had pulled cannons and new anchors. The rope hissed like a snake that had been stepped on. The miller hit the snag, and the snag rolled under him, and his head went under. Eliza had a hand around his collar when he surfaced, and her grip slipped because denim is a liar when wet. She shoved her hand under his arm instead and hooked it at the armpit like she had done 100 times, with birthing women who fainted and husbands who swayed. Her feet slid. The baby inside thrummed alarm. Her lungs burned. She got him a breath. He gasped and fixed his eyes on hers, and trust, like a nail, went between them. Salu's loop dropped over both of them and jerked tight. Blacka grunted and set his weight. "Pull," he barked, and the miller and Eliza rose together slow as bread in a cold kitchen. The crowd found its old use and leaned on the rope behind the two men, hands coming from everywhere, a chain of grip that made nonsense of who liked who. The wheel creaked and turned, and shed a spill of water that sheeted over them like clear cloth. Eliza kept hold. The miller coughed up a fish smell and swore, and then laughed, because alive is funny. They came up the last 2 feet and rolled onto the planks in a mess of limbs and rope and breath. For a long moment, no one remembered the parsonage or the sheriff or the register, or the idea that men can write a life smaller than it is. Everyone looked at the 2 wet people, and the rope and the water, and the way the creek had said yes when asked. Then sound slammed back. The boys who had thought themselves brave whooped like coyotes, and then hid their faces because their eyes ran. The mother of the first child kissed the miller's hand, and her child's hair, and Eliza's hem, in one frantic sequence that would embarrass her later, and not now. Blacka stood and wiped his face with his sleeve, and did not try to look like he had meant to lie in water that day. He had not, but he would always choose rope over paper if somebody was drowning. Salu shook out his hands and flexed his fingers and felt a fire under the skin where the rope had burned. He liked that pain. It was honest. Della, standing a little distance, watched all the faces. She did not clap or cry. She counted. She counted who looked away when the sheriff walked up as if he still owned the ground. Voss stepped to the edge of the crowd and let his shape take up space. He did not shout. He did not need to. People hush themselves when a star glints. He looked at Eliza, wet and breathing hard, hair stuck to her temple, belly round. He opened his mouth to say a thing that would put her back in the place he liked. He did not get to speak first. Asa Pike, hatless and pale with courage, held his copy up, and his voice, thin and jittering, cut in. "Sheriff Voss told me to write a name I had not seen," he said. "He told me a river did what men did." He shook the paper so hard it rattled. "I near wrote it. I near made a ledger a liar. I have been ashamed every hour since. I tell you now, because I saw this woman pull a child out of water, and not bargain for it." He lifted his chin, in a motion nobody expected from a man who inked pages for a living. "I will not let a liar write me. Not in my own book." The crowd turned its head to Asa. Voss did not move. He made his face quiet like a pond in shade, but his fingers, tucked on his belt, tapped time. And that small beat told anyone watching that the stillness had grown teeth. Eliza felt the moment shift, like wind turning. One big thing had happened. Now small ones would dictate where it went. Voss could arrest Asa for disorder. He could call out the army for interference. He could turn on his heel and go write warrants and make paper his knife. He chose the last. "Mr. Pike," he said soft, "you may bring your concerns to my office. Better that than hollering in the street." He turned to Black. "Lieutenant, keep your men at their post. I will deal with this county business." He turned to Mott. "Reverend, you may minister to your flock." He turned to Caleb, who had pushed forward out of need to be seen. "Son, we will speak of your certificate later." He smiled with his mouth only and left. The crowd made space without thinking. Men and women who would later call themselves brave stepped back to let him pass. He did not hurry. He did not show his back to any man longer than necessary. He walked out of sight. When he had gone, people exhaled. Sound crept back in bits. Black looked at Eliza and at Salu, and at the rope, and at Asa. He nodded once, as if a thing had been decided inside his head. "Tonight," he said quiet to Salu, "we gather the papers. We put them in one place with doors and men." Salu glanced at Della. Della nodded. "Church," she said, "because if men burn it, they show their teeth to God and to themselves. That keeps some hands from matches." Black's mouth twisted. He was not a man who believed churches stopped men, but he liked walls and pews and the way they organized a space. "Church," he said, at dark. The afternoon crawled like a lizard warmed too long. Eliza's arms ached from river and rope. Her wrists ached from wire. Her belly shifted low and forward, as if the child had moved toward the door inside her. She leaned against the cottonwood and closed her eyes for 3 breaths and saw water and wood and a ledger, and a scraped name. Della came and pressed a cool cloth to the back of Eliza's neck, and said nothing. Tsalu sat on his heels in the dirt and watched ants make roads around the stick wrapped with wire. He marveled at how straight their lines were without paper. At dusk, lanterns winked in the town, like stars rehearsing. People went to their suppers. Dogs curled. Men who planned harm did their best work then, not too soon to be seen, not too late to lose their nerve. Black brought 2 men with him to the church, and Mott opened the doors wide as if to invite wind. Asa arrived with his ledger under his coat. He trembled so hard the ledger tapped against his buttons. Eliza and Tsalu came by the side, and Della behind. The child who had been saved put a posy on the step and ran away. The miller sent a jug of cider and a loaf, because some debts cannot be tallied, but men try. Black placed the sealed hospital file on the altar, with a solemnity that made Mott flinch at his own sacred hand's envy. Asa set his ledger on a front pew. Mott took the parish register and laid it open to the scraped page in front of the hymn books. He lit 2 sconces. The light turned the scrape into a river line cutting through the neat writing. "Speak your papers," Della murmured, not mocking. "Make the night hear you." People drifted, not a crowd, a handful. The brave, the curious, the contrary. The woman with the saved child stood in back with her hands on the little one's shoulders. The miller came and stood with his pole like a staff. 2 ranch hands from a place that did not like the rookers stood in the shadows near the door, eyes bright. Mason stood at the side wall. Black took his place by the altar not as a priest, but as a clerk of truth. Mott stepped forward, throat working. He read the hymn number first, voice thin. He read the scraped line, halting. He said the words, "Sheriff Voss told me," and half the people present sucked air, as if they had each stepped into a cold creek, up to the knee. He bowed his head when he finished, and the gesture was not affected. A sound from outside cut the next breath. Insect high, child small, then the deeper rush of men. The church doors jolted as if pushed by a shoulder. Black lifted his hand, and his 2 soldiers leveled rifles without aiming them at anyone yet. Voss's voice came through, amused. "Evening service?" he said. "You collect what's mine." He let the quiet hold that until someone jangled with nerves. No one did. He rattled the latch once, in a lazy way. "Send her out," he said finally, as if asking for extra bread from a kitchen. "Send my ghost woman out." No one moved to open the door. Eliza put her hand on the back of the nearest pew and felt the small carvings there, initials cut by a boy, 10 years ago, who had thought himself wicked for it, and smiled without humor. She felt the child push low again. She knew her water would not break, while a star shone in that doorway. Bodies and souls have a sense of timing. Tsalu shifted 1 foot. Della drew the bone-handled knife under her shawl, but kept it close, not raised. Asa's hands flattened on the ledger, as if to hold it from trembling off the wood. Caleb's voice spoke next, tight and thin. "Eliza," he said, "come out and sign. I will make it right after. It's simpler." Behind his voice lay the panic of a boy who hears the pieces of a plan grinding against each other and knows another round of lies will be needed to grease it. The deputies muttered. Someone outside kicked a bucket just to make a noise. It toppled and rolled and clanged itself into silence against the church step. Black lifted the sealed file. "Sheriff," he called, tone formal. "An army document contradicts your statement. An undertaker's record is in dispute. A parish register bears marks of coercion. If you enter, you will be detained." Silence ran its fingers along the pewbacks and made the wood hum a little under Eliza's hand. Voss said nothing for a long 3 heartbeats. When he spoke, his voice had no smile left in it. "Lieutenant," he said, "I will count to 60. Then I will come in and take what is mine. Your men can decide who they are." Tsalu looked at Eliza and then at the side door. Churches always have one, for coffins and cows. He thought of pulling the dam rope again, of making the creek run through the churchyard and set torches sputtering. He thought of the women and the child inside. He thought of a better trick. He touched Della's sleeve. She met his eye and nodded. They moved not for the side door, but for the back where the little window with wavy glass gave a view of the mill bridge. because a creak matters more to courage than a door. Eliza followed, Black, catching it, stepped sideways with the altar and the file in one motion that put him between whatever came and the records. Mott lifted the register in both hands as if to guard it with his meat. Asa bent over his ledger like a man over a child in a storm. Voss's voice counted, slow, sweet as poison. 1. Outside, a horse snorted. 2. A match scratched. 3. Eliza reached the wavy glass and looked out. The mill bridge showed in yolk dark. 2 boys still there, though their mothers had surely told them to be home. The wheel turning regular as a heart at last. The rope coiled neat again on its peg. A woman crossed, ignoring the count, because numbers said out loud by a bad man do not bind good women. 4. Della lifted the latch at the back and eased it. Small, controlled, sound, lost under the murmuring in the yard. 5. Salu slid into the grass and became water to the eyes. 6. Black found that his voice did not want to be as calm as it had been. He put iron in it anyway. Sheriff, he called, stop your count. Voss said 7, but softer, because it is hard to keep an even tone when another man does not play your game. 8. Asa whispered to himself the names of everyone he had written in the ledger. 1 for every number, the sheriff said, and got himself through it by that dumb prayer. 9. The woman on the bridge saw Salu's shape flicker below and drew in a breath she did not know she had held, and walked on and did not scream because something in her recognized ally. 10. The creek below looked almost gentle until you stepped wrong. It fed on mistakes. Salu moved along the bank to the place where a small rope he had set earlier lay half hidden in grass. He felt for the knot. He looked up at Eliza, who looked down through the wavy glass, and he touched the rope and then pointed downstream at the place where the current tore off at an angle and made a boiling elbow. Eliza nodded once. She could read him now with less effort than she could read the thick letters men wrote on walls to tell people what not to do. 11, came Voss's voice, slightly too loud now. The deputies shuffled. Caleb said, this is foolish, which was true in a way he did not mean. 12. Eliza slid out the back and took the slope in a crouch the way she had learned to move with a dress, when men liked to watch. Della ghosted behind, knife pressed along her forearm. The saved child's mother, seeing them, made a small frantic motion to ward them back, and then stopped herself, and instead stepped closer to the door, to listen, and to be a body counted among bodies. 13. Black set his feet, and thought of his mother's kitchen table, and how solid it had been, and decided to be that shape. 14. Mott mouthed a prayer and took no comfort from it, and kept holding the book anyway. Voss reached 20, and the yard breathed wrong. He slowed a hair, because he liked to control pace. He did not know that in the black along the bank, Salu found the second knot, and the third. He did not know that the small brush dam he had built in daylight with the miller's boy's help, under the pretense of catching floating firewood, sat ready to give with one good pull, and that when it gave the creek, would not flood the church. No, it would tear through the gap by the cottonwood, where the posse would have to stand to come in, and it would make the ground slick as eel skin under their boots, and their torches would cough out in the damp. 21. Caleb shifted from foot to foot like a boy who needs to piss and cannot find a bush. 22. Eliza placed her feet where Salu had earlier, almost by scent. She felt the rope under her palm. Della pressed close enough to share breath. When? Della whispered. Eliza did not answer. She could feel the timing in her teeth. 27. A deputy near the doors rolled his shoulders. He wanted to kick wood. He held it. He told himself he would lead when the moment came, and knew in the quiet part of his mind he would not. 28. The crowd beyond the yard, curious, half there, shifted a little too, pulled by the click-click of numbers. 29. Inside, Asa made his hand lie still. A sound cut through the count that did not belong. A high, light squeal from the mill, wheel-happy, followed by a giggle and a scold and a boy's bravado. Eliza's head snapped. She saw, through the wavy dark, the 2 boys back on the rail, emboldened by being shooed away and coming back, hanging from their knees now, showing the whole invisible town that fear had no claim. The mother who had saved her child was not there to stop them. She stood with her ear to the church door to hear what men with stars decided about women with names. The boys tipped farther. One reached to touch his toes to the water, because that makes a sweet shock on the foot. He reached too far. His hold slipped. He grabbed for his friend. The friend grabbed for air. They seesawed and balanced for a breath that cost a county a year, and then both went. Eliza did not think. Again. She lunged. Again. Not for the bank, but for the rope in Salu's hand. Salu was already pulling the first knot loose. He looked at her, looked at the boys, looked at the church door where Eli was about to walk in wearing boots, and in that breath chose the water. Della's hand flashed and cut a second line, knowing exactly what chaos would help and what would drown. The dam gave with a sigh, like a chest that had held breath too long. Water leaped sidelong, full-bodied, joyful. Torches hissed. Men swore and slid and went to their knees. Voss's count strangled on 33 and turned into a curse. Inside, Black slammed the bar on the church door before a slopping body could push it, and turned in the same motion, with the sealed file clutched to his ribs. Mott staggered and braced the register on the pulpit like a man bracing a child on his hip. Asa threw himself on his ledger, as if it could swim, and he could teach it. On the bridge the boys hit the water hard and wrong, the way boys do, arms wide, mouths open. Eliza had the rope. Salu had her elbow. He flung the loop with a fury that was not anger, but precision, honed by true anger. The loop snapped the nearer boy by the chest and pinned an arm. The farther boy went under. Eliza dove without bargaining with herself. The rope burned her palm raw in one stripe. She felt under the churn for a shoulder and found hair, and did what water does to women when they decide. She did not lift. She flowed. She moved with and slightly against. She made the creek's shoulder her own. She and Salu, together with the rope, and Della with her body braced, like a post, hauled one boy screeching from surprise, and the other spitting from terror, onto the angle where plank met stone. They both grabbed everything in reach and cried like men. The yard, stupid by the flood slick and their own curses, froze to watch. Voss found his feet on the slippery grass, with that mean grace bad men have. They practice in private. He hit the door with his shoulder. In a rage, a star could not help. The bar held. He stepped back to order fire, and found his torches dead and his matches wet. He looked at the creek like it had insulted his mother. He would shoot. He would put a bullet through a hinge. He would not care who stood behind it, because he had told himself so long and loud that the county was him that he could not hear other songs. He reached for his pistol. Caleb grabbed his sleeve. "Sheriff," he said, voice high, "not in front of the soldiers." Voss shook him off like burrs. "Boy," he said, and did not say what came next because a rope whipped past his ear and kissed his hat brim off into the mud. He turned and saw Salu on the bank, with the coil in his hands, and the look of a man who could cut a world into water and walk away dry. He lifted his pistol and drew a bead. On the bridge, one of the boys chose that exact breath to slip again, because his legs were jelly and his feet foolish. Eliza went to grab. The choice sat between two heartbeats and demanded now. She saw Salu at the end of a barrel. She saw a boy at the edge of going under again. She saw Della's knife, small and astonished at how much work words made for it. She could only reach one. Eliza chose the boy. Her body moved before the thought finished, as if the creek itself had reached up and taken her by the ribs and turned her where it needed her. She planted one hand on the slick plank, grabbed the boy's shirt with the other, and hauled him against her with enough force to drive a grunt out of both their lungs. Behind her, the pistol cracked. The sound tore the air and slapped back from the church wall. Salu's head snapped to the side, hat spinning off. He dropped low in the same breath, not from fear, but from the old instinct that taught him how bullets ride wind. The slug took a bite from the church door, where the hinge met the jamb, and spat splinters like teeth. The boy screamed and clutched Eliza's neck, and she coughed River twice, and kept her feet with a stubbornness that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with refusal. Della did not throw her knife. She did something smaller and meaner. She flicked her wrist and took the rope from the peg and sent the loop low, not at a man, but at the gun hand. The coil struck Voss's wrist and jerked his aim a quarter-inch. He fired again, and the shot went wide and broke the glass of the parsonage lamp, which hissed and went to smoke. Black didn't wait. He raised his own pistol, not to shoot into a crowd, but to split the air like a bell and make every eye turn toward the law they still halfway believed in. "Sheriff Malcolm Voss," he said, voice carrying like a steel edge. "Drop your weapon." He put the sealed file under his arm like a man guarding a child and sighted down the barrel without shaking. Mason at his shoulder held steady, too. The deputies hesitated. Habit, loyalty, pride, all trying to pick a direction. Caleb Rooker backed a step, hands up, palms stupid, mouth open. Voss smiled a thin smile as if this were a private joke that had grown too public. He kept the pistol. He looked at Black and said softly, "Lieutenant, you do not own this county." Lifted the gun toward the church again. He never finished the motion. The miller's pole, wielded by a man who'd had water up his nose and enough fear for one day, swung from the side and smacked Voss in the forearm with the clean crack of seasoned ash on bone. The pistol flew and thudded in mud. Voss spun with a curse, grabbed for the pole, ripped it free, and went for the miller's head. The miller ducked. The pole spent itself against a post. Black closed the space between uniforms and lies and slammed Voss into the door he'd shot, shouldering him with the weight of a man who'd hauled cannon before breakfast. Mason pinned the sheriff's weapon arm. The deputies staggered, indecision breaking like rot in a beam. One bolted. The other put his hand up and said, "I'm not hanging for you," and stepped back. Salu rose with his hat in his hand and a new cut along his temple that made his skin feel every heartbeat. He did not waste breath on it. He stepped forward as Voss tried to drive his shoulder into Black's ribs. He caught the sheriff's boot with his heel and hooked him. Voss went onto his back in the mud with a grunt that carried shame in it. Black took the man's wrist and twisted until the star pinched under the coat-bit skin. He said, "You are under arrest for falsifying a deposition, for coercing a cleric, for attempted murder." He spoke each charge like a railroad spike. Voss's eyes went flat. He looked up past all the faces at the church eaves, and then down at the mud, as if it had betrayed him too. Caleb watched his courage run out into the street like stove water. He saw the crowds curl inward, and knew that whatever future he thought he could buy, with paper and threats, had been caught in a gear, and would grind him if he stayed. He did the one desperate, decent thing left in him. He shouted, "I set the wire," and the words rang against wood and bone. His father's name was not in them, but the boy spat his own truth, and it was something. The crowd turned to look at him as one body. He threw his hands out. "I tied it," he said, voice breaking. "I tied it to the root and the stone. I tied it like you tie a calf. I meant to scare her off the claim. That's all." The sheriff, he faltered. Voss, pinned, turned his head and stared at him with hatred cold as deep water. Caleb swallowed and looked at his boots, and then looked up. The sheriff said the county needed it. He finished in a small voice that fooled nobody. Eliza stood with both boys on the plank and felt her knees go weak now that the bodies on the bank had stopped trying to die. The boys clung and cried. She patted heads and said, "You're all right," 10 times, until the words became a rhythm. Della slipped up and took one boy to his mother, with a nod that dared anyone to make a poem of this woman again. Salu stepped to Eliza's side and put a hand under her elbow, and the small tremor in his fingers told her the bullet had passed close enough to taste. "You're bleeding," she said, and he snorted. "You too," he said, looking at the raw rope burn up her arm and the wire marks that had opened again. The crowd pressed and then parted around them, the way grass leans from wind. The saved child's mother bowed her head, simple and deep. It steadied Eliza more than any loud thanks would have. Black pulled Voss to his feet. He turned him toward the church with a hand between shoulder blades. The miller's pole slid down to the boards, and lay there like a dead thing. Asa stepped forward, hatless still, hair sticking up. He tucked the ledger under his arm and took the stick wrapped with barbed wire from Salu and held it up for the town to see. "This is what they tied her with," he said. "This and a prayer they said over the creek to call it accident." His voice shook and then got stronger. "I will write this night in my book, not in the clean column people like, in the ugly part where men confess." He looked at Black. "Lieutenant, keep me honest if I wobble." Black nodded once. "I will." They brought Voss through the church door, and the wet mark his boots left looked like 2 blots in a ledger. Mott stood straight behind the pulpit with the register open, his face bloodless but his mouth set. He watched the sheriff walk in and had the startled thought that no matter how many sermons a man preaches, he does not expect to see this. He cleared his throat, and for once his voice came without syrup. "Sheriff Malcolm Voss," he said steady, "I wrote a lie for you." Voss turned his head and smiled, that sliver of blade smile. "You wrote what calms," he said. "Same as always." Mott's hand tightened on the book. "No," he said. "I wrote what kept you large." The room took that in and breathed quiet. Black set the sealed hospital file on the altar again and placed his palm on it as if claiming ground. "This document says a woman was pulled from the water," he said. "It names the man who pulled her." He nodded once at Mason, who spoke the syllabary words without flourish. "Water pulled. Fox." Black lifted the sheriff's neat deposition with 2 fingers and held it away from himself like something damp. "This says no rescue occurred," he said. "It bears your name." He did not look at Voss when he spoke. He looked at the town. "If paper is to rule here, it will do so without lies." He handed the deposition to Mason. "Keep it," he said. "Don't let it walk." Eliza stepped into the aisle. Mud flaked from her hem and left a trail. She put her hand flat on the back of the front pew to find her balance, then took it away. She did not want the wood to carry the shape of her fear. She stood 2 arm lengths from Voss and 1 from Mott. She lifted her chin. "Reverend," she said, "read the scrape." Mott swallowed and put his finger on the thin place where the blade had taken her name. He read it, halting at first, then certain. "Eliza Harrow," he said, voice carrying without effort now, as if the room wanted it. "Memorial notice. Struck through by my own hand, at the request of Sheriff Malcolm Voss." He closed his eyes when he said the last 3 words, then opened them again, and did not look away. "I repent it," he said. "I will mend it the only way I can. I will write rescued beside it, and leave the scrape to show what we did." Caleb let out a thin whimper. At the back of the church, the sound of a boy who knows a rope in the yard has his name on it, even if nobody has tied it yet. He tried one last tack. "Eliza," he said, "we could make this easier. Sign the certificate. We can make it look right." He held up the folded paper with fingers that thought they were clever. The air around him grew colder, in the way of rooms, when everyone present decides at once they do not want to share breath with a man. Eliza did not speak to him. She spoke to the town. "A man who ties wire to roots will tie paper to throats," she said. "I will not wear either." She reached into the seam of her skirt and drew out the claim paper she had sewn there weeks ago, now wrinkled and dried and soft from river, but legible. She held it up. "This is mine," she said. "This, and the child." She caught the tremor in her own hands and made it be strength. "And I will stay." Black took the claim and looked at it the way a man looks at a map that says, "A place is real." He nodded once. "The army will witness that this paper was presented and read," he said. "If a county clerk tries to lose it, he will find more trouble than a desk can carry." The clerk in the back, who had been pretending not to be there, twitched as if slapped, and then took out his own pencil and made a note without knowing why. Voss laughed, a short sound with no heat, as if his breath had been spent somewhere he could not retrieve it from. "You think this ends with paper and one night," he said. "You think men do not want quiet more than they want truth. Watch them. They will go home. They will leave you to me again, when this soldier goes." He looked at Black with contempt that had the small, sharp smell of a man who fears a thing and will not name it. "You'll be transferred before summer," he said. "You'll fold your coat and carry your little files, and this county will still be mine when flood is done. Black did not answer in words. He reached for the sheriff's star, the borrowed tin he had polished, and he unpinned it. He did it slow. He put it on the altar beside the sealed file, and Mott's register and Asa's ledger. It lay there dull under candle and wall smoke. The town stared at the small heap of metal and paper, and the sheriff looked smaller without it. Some men do. A sound came from outside then, that cut the room clean and sent the hair up on people's arms. The creek's voice rising. It had been dropping all afternoon, but rain upriver had found its way down, with the speed water remembers. The wind twisted and brought the smell of wet wood and mud fresh torn. The wheel groaned and spun twice in a rush, and caught on something heavy, and stopped dead. People shifted and looked at the door, the way men in old churches always have when weather speaks. Eliza felt it in her bones like memory. She knew that sound. The Ford, she said to no one. The Ford will lay things down. Black nodded once to Tsalu. Tsalu was already moving. Della ghosted after him, knife under shawl. Eliza went too. No one told her to sit. No one could have made her. They stepped into a night made new by smell. The crowd flowed as crowds do when weather gives orders men cannot argue. They went down the street and along the bank, and came to the ford, where the creek runs shallow in summer and treacherous in spring. Flood had let go upriver, and now sent its harvest. Branches, fence posts, a dead pig, a packet of grass tangled around a hat with a crushed crown, and a spool of wire, bright and ugly, clanking against stone as if eager to bite something again. It lodged in the shallows, and rolled and stuck and lay there like a confession. Eliza walked to the edge with her hem dragging, with her child heavy, with her wrists burning, and she pointed. That, she said, there is the county's voice. Black stepped down and waded into the water to his boots, and lifted the spool with both hands. It weighed like guilt. He turned and put it down in the road, where everyone could see the brand stamped into the iron collar. Rooker. He did not read it aloud. He did not need to. The sound the town made then was not a cheer, not a groan. It was that small uplift a crowd gives when a thing settles properly at last. Men looked at Caleb. He took a breath that sounded like he had swallowed a nail. I tied it, he said again, smaller. I did not mean to drown her. He meant it. It did not matter. The truth did what it does. It separated intent from act, and then judged both. A voice from the back of the crowd called, trembly with whiskey and fear, "String him!" Another called, "Trial!" And another, "Let the army take him!" And the sound bunched into knots of men's wants. Della stepped into the space between the spool and the first set of hands. She looked at the rope in those hands, and then at the water, and then at the rope again. The cottonwood has had enough rope tonight, she said. The men, to their credit, dropped their eyes. The rope sagged and slid and made a dark mark on the road, like a snake, too tired to lift its head. Black took Caleb's arm and turned him to face Eliza. Say it to her, he said. Caleb looked at her, and the stone of her quiet made him open his mouth and tell the simple thing left. I am sorry, he said, true as he had ever been. Eliza watched his face a long breath, long enough to feel if the words had meat. You are sorry for yourself, she said, not unkind. Someday you may be sorry for me. That day will come when you look at something you love and see wire around it that you set. Caleb's mouth crumpled and then set. He nodded once. He did not make any motion toward her. He held out his wrists to Black, the way men do when they understand, late, that hands are the price of bad work. Black bound them with a leather thong, not rope, and led him aside. Voss stood flicking mud from his sleeve with his free hand, face blank, and eyes murderous. He watched his own star lie on the altar, and found that what he had thought made him big had made him small, and that left him no useful move. He looked at the creek and hated it. He looked at the church and hated it. He looked at the people and found in them the dull, dangerous glint of men who will gossip about you when you are gone and speak your name in the wrong tone when you pass. It burned him more than any rope would. Asa came down the road with the ledger open to a clean line. He did not make a speech. He took his pencil, the one he licked out of habit, and did not now. And he wrote. He wrote the date. He wrote the weather the way he always did. He wrote, Eliza Harrow, rescued from the creek at the ford, witness to fraud. And then he underlined the word rescued once. Slow. He did not put her in the dead column. He made a living line. The book did not know what to do with it, and then it did. Paper is flexible when you force it. He held the ledger up. Men and women craned. First living entry, he said in a voice that had gotten bigger tonight without getting louder. I will show any who wish to see. He looked over the page at Eliza, and his mouth trembled, and he steadied it and nodded. The air changed. The long tension that had kept the town humped like a dog under a storm eased. People straightened spines they had not known were bent. The saved child reached for Eliza's hand with a sticky palm, and Eliza took it and felt her own knees give a tiny shake that told her the flood inside her had run down as far as it could go without the last work starting. A warm pressure rolled low and deep. She swallowed and put a hand at the base of her belly, the way midwives do when they take a measure nobody else can see. She looked at Della, and Della knew. Soon, Della said, and grinned for the first time in 2 days, a flash of teeth that had no mercy for men and much for women. They walked back to the church to finish the work. Black signed a note to the county clerk with his name large and his handwriting uncompromising. Army inquiry. Do not alter records. Mason took charge of Voss and Caleb for the night, with a detail no one in town wanted to test. Mott wrote the word rescued, where Eliza told him to, and left the scrape staring up at God and everybody. He closed the book and put his hand on it and said a prayer that was not fancy and did not ask for much, just that his cowardice stay named so. He could see it next time. Eliza sat on the front pew for a breath and felt a mild cramp pass like a shadow, and then another that made her breath catch. She smiled into it, small and private. Tsalu saw the change in her face and in the way she held her shoulders. He looked at Della, and she nodded. We go to the lodge, Della said, half teasing. The door is ugly. Good. Let the child look on the truth first thing. Eliza stood. The town saw her stand. A little aisle opened by itself. She walked through it the same way water finds the lowest line, not because it is weak, but because that is where the work is. They reached the cedar grove under a sky wiped to clean. The brand on the door lay blurred from Della's stonework, not gone, not hidden, just ruined for the purpose it was meant for. Inside, the coals glowed. Della laid clean cloth. Tsalu hung a kettle and then stood back, because he knew when men are useful and when they are in the way. Eliza breathed through a tightness that came and went like a wave. She swayed and smiled and made a sound that women and some men know, a little hum that sets the body to the task. The creek outside said its soft night piece. Somewhere, an owl made its query and got no answer because the mouse it asked lay already quiet. Labor does what it does. It makes time stupid and exact. It pulled Eliza deep and then let her up and then pulled her again, and each time she came back with more information about herself than she had a minute before. Della's hands were warm and covered in old stories. She spoke little. She poured hot water over cloth and wiped a brow and pressed a back. Tsalu walked the dark and kept the night from intruding with his presence the way a man stands at a gate and makes himself gate-shaped. He did not try to catch stars. He kept foxwatch on the path for men who like to ruin quiet. None came. When the baby pushed at last with the relentless simple will all children bring, Eliza felt fire that burned the last of the fear out of her and replaced it with something she had not known she owned, something like a steel wire that does not cut but holds. She pushed once, and then again, and then again, and there he was, angry and wet and loud, a boy with the creek's voice. Della lifted him, checked his mouth, rubbed him rough, and he yelled at the world in the manner of all things born into it. Tsalu stood at the door then, because he knew the sound of a first cry, and also knew not to hurry it with male hands. Eliza lay back and laughed, the weak, wicked laugh of a woman who has won a fight and will take a long breath before the next one. Della wrapped the boy and put him in Eliza's arms, and Eliza counted toes the way women do and kissed the crease between his eyes like a seal. "Hello," she said. "You took your time." Tsalu stepped in, water bottle in hand, and looked with a care that could be mistaken for shyness. The boy hiccuped and blinked, and turned his head toward the door, as if he knew the direction of creeks already. Della said, "Name him for someone who did not drown." Eliza looked at Tsalu, and then down at the little red face and smiled. "Fox," she said, "but that is for us. For the papers, he will be Thomas, like his father. Let the world have that name to write." Della nodded approval. She knew the use of two names in a world that wants to reduce everything to one line. Morning slid in like mercy. The town woke to a new arrangement of faces and facts. Asa sat at his window with the ledger open to the living line, letting anyone who wanted look and touch. Men did, sheepish and curious, and some made a mark with their finger along the words "rescued," as if to learn the shape by skin. Mott left his church open and his register on the rail with a note. "Here is the scrape. Here is the repair. Read both." Black wrote his report with sentences like nails. Mason carried Voss and Caleb to the fort and did not let anyone along the way make a story of it. He did not need to swing glory. He just walked. By noon, the creek had dropped to its honest bank and left the ford strewn with its confessions. In among the branches and the spools and the splinters, the boys found a small tin of carbolic with Eliza's mark and took it to her, as if delivering treasure to a queen. She laughed and thanked them like equals and put the tin on the shelf by the cradle. Della's neighbor carved fast with soft hands and good knife. The cradle rocked when a breeze made the cedar smoke curl. Eliza chose the clinic cabin by the creek, the one near the ford, so the water's voice would never be far, and the town would have to walk past the place they tried to make her a ghost. Tsalu mended the door and hung the little rope for washing. Della hung a medicine bundle from the lintel and hid the knife in the rafters again, where it could see the room, but not frighten anyone. The first patient came by afternoon, a ranch hand with a finger cut to the bone, who said he had been against her and was not anymore. Eliza tied his finger tight and told him to keep it clean and not lie. He paid in eggs because that is what he had. Caleb's hearing came quick to keep men from foolishness. Asa stood like a man who had found a bone under the floor and felt lighter for finding it. Mott told the truth with his hands on the rail and did not excuse himself beyond the one apology. Black spoke simple and wrote a copy of the copy and countersigned it. The court did not swing rope. It swung time. Caleb went to the stockade for a season and then to his father's ranch with a pen instead of a loop. He lived long enough to watch fence wire bite his own skin and remember a spool in a ford. He never bragged tall again. Voss did not get rope either. He got the long, slow cut of papers. He went to a bigger cell farther downriver, where men who liked to smoke behind doors told jokes with his name in them. He grew smaller inside clothes that stayed the same size. He learned what silence sounds like when it is not the kind you order. Weeks turned. The flood left seeds in the silt. Grass came up new and innocent, the way it does even after bad spring. Men in the town walked softer along the creek bank and did not throw things in for a while. Children put flowers on the cottonwood's roots, and then forgot, and then remembered, as children will. Eliza's wrists healed to thin snakes under the skin. She traced them when she felt weak and remembered not to be. The boy slept in the cradle and woke and yelled and fed and slept again. Tsalu rode the trace, thumbed the braids on his horse's mane, and checked the ford after every rain. Sometimes he stood on the bank at dusk, with his hands in his pockets, and breathed, and said his brother's name, and said the child's in the same breath, and felt the world not break apart. At the undertaker's, Asa kept the ledger open sometimes to the living line, just to give his eyes a rest from the other columns. The page flattened out over days, losing its wave, but a faint ripple remained, a little remnant, like the way water dries on a man's shirt and leaves a salt ring. He did not smooth it. He let the sheet carry its own memory. When people came to look, he told the story, not like a legend, but like a math problem, with 3 papers that canceled falseness and left truth behind. It calmed him to tell it that way. Reverend Mott preached short. He did not wear his voice like a costume anymore. He kept the register where people could see it and put the knife he had used to scrape the page in a drawer and did not touch it. He learned to say the word mercy only when it meant mercy. He failed some days. He wrote those failures down in a little book not meant for anyone's eyes and read it on Fridays and tried to be ready for Sundays with clean hands. Black got his transfer order, just as Voss had predicted. He folded his coat. He wrapped the sealed hospital file in canvas and sent it with a copy to his major, with a note that said, in neat script, "This page corrected a county." He shook hands with Asa and Mott. He nodded to Della and did not insult her with thanks. He stood outside Eliza's door and looked at the boy and at the creek and at Salu and at Eliza and said, "Paper did good here, but it was the water." Eliza smiled. "It was both," she said, "and some hands." He saluted the boy, a little jest, and the child sneezed as if to bless him. Black smiled, a thing he did not do much, and rode out. People said he left behind a small hole the size of a straight back. The hole did not stay empty. Other people stood a little taller to fit it. On the first hot day of true summer, Eliza sat on her step, with the boy at her breast, and watched the creek go by at its lazy speed, not the killing speed of spring, not the lying speed of drought. She heard laughter from the mill. She heard Della humming inside as she pounded roots. She heard Salu whittle a stick into a smooth something for small hands to chew. Across the ford, on the Rooker fence, a new wire gleamed. It was set higher and with better sense. It did not cross the flood path. She let herself approve, not forgiveness, just correctness. Late light made the surface of the water look like hammered tin. A small bundle came down on the current, caught on a root, spun, and came loose. Eliza stood and stepped to the edge. It was a child's rag doll, swollen with creek and stained with silt. She lifted it by the leg, and water ran from its hair in a thin stream. She turned it over and considered its bent arm and its little stitched eyes. She set it on the step in sun, and the water bled out of it, and a stain formed in a shape that looked like a cloud, and then like nothing at all. She smiled because sometimes a thing is just a thing. Before the heat gave up and the night let crickets speak, Asa came by with the ledger under his coat, as if he could not bear to be away from the one page in his life that behaved like a living thing. He asked if she would like to see it again, as if she might have forgotten. She laughed and took it, and ran her finger under the words, while the child's breath warmed her arm. "Rescued," she read. Simple. Witness to fraud. The words did not taste bitter now. They tasted like iron at the edge of a spring. She closed the book and handed it back, and thanked him with her eyes, and he tried not to cry, and failed, and turned away, and pretended to cough. Della made a soft noise behind them that said, "Men weeping is no crime." Salu looked up from his whittling and grinned at Asa without teeth, and the undertaker caught the joke in it and smiled through wet anyway. The town would tell the story as it always does, trimming and fancying until it fit the mouths that told it. Some would make Eliza a ghost still, because people like their ghosts better than their women. Some would make Salu a legend with no brother and no cut on his temple, because legends do not bruise. Some would make Della a witch, and then a saint, and then a woman again, when they needed tea for a fever. Paper would keep its small, tidy lines. Creek would keep its path until a storm changed it. The cottonwood would sprout a new shoot from the place. The rope burned it, and the shoot would grow green and ordinary as grass. That night, with the boy asleep and the door open to the cool, Eliza sat at her table and wrote 3 neat lines on the back of the claim paper with a pencil that had been sharpened on a knife. She wrote the date. She wrote the weather. She wrote, "We are still here." She tucked the paper back into its seam and smoothed her skirt and laughed because the secret now was not fear, but pride. She blew the lamp out and lay down. The creek spoke in its sleep. The baby dreamed with tiny fists. Salu's breathing outside the door slid into the rhythm of a man who has made peace with a river. Della snored once and denied it in the morning. The county did not go gentle or perfect. After, it did what places do. It forgot and remembered by turns. It needed reminding. The ledger sat ready. The register sat open to the scrape and the rescue. The sealed file rested where the next man could find it and learn the word for water pulled. Every spring the creek rose and laid fresh wire in the ford. Tsalu picked it up and put it in a pile near the cottonwood, and every time a new piece clanked down, Eliza smiled, because confessions gathered themselves now without anyone asking. And if, some dusk, you stand by that ford and see a small flash where the water vaults a stone and think it is a trick of light, look down. The creek keeps small truths and sets them at your feet if you let it. The undertaker knows where they fit. The register holds the scrape. The sealed file keeps its syllables. And if the ledger speaks again, you'll know which page to open first.